righty. We've got one more session for you this afternoon. I'd like to ask our speakers to come forward. And for this session, we want to highlight private sector and public policy opportunities to develop predictable, higher value markets that can drive investing in carbon capture project deployment. We've got two really good speakers who are going to take us through that, and I'll introduce them one at a time. They will both give their each give their presentation, and then we'll save questions for the end. Start with Marcius Extavour. Marcius is Executive Director of NRG COSIA Carbon XPRIZE. He is the energy lead on the XPRIZE project, and we're working at the intersection of science, technology, and public policy. He leads the energy team, including the $20 million NRG COSIA Carbon XPRIZE, which is a global competition to recycle CO2 into valuable products. Before joining XPRIZE, he was focused on technology and policy in clean energy as an independent consultant at the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. Dr. Extavour holds a PhD in quantum optics and atomic physics. I had to say that just because it sounded really cool. And also a BASc in engineering science from the University of Toronto. So we're very excited to have you here and look forward to your presentation. Marcius?
Thank you. Can you hear me if I speak at this volume? Yeah. I can hear myself, great. So I think we're at the final session. I saw a few people head for the coffee or for the exits. It's a terrible mistake. I think this session is going to be a little different than some of the others. We're going to take a different angle on carbon, what we can do with it, and here I think we're specifically talking about uses of carbon, whether it's CO2, CO, to make productive materials and uses, and also ties into the power sector and other places. I think procurement is the theme of our session. Before I get started, hands up if you took a photo like I did of the beautiful mountains, I think, that are out this way. Everyone did, right? They're spectacular. We love looking at them, we love enjoying them. We're in a national park. I think preserving sites like that is one of the reasons we care. It's one of the reasons you should stay awake for this final session. But really, one of the predictions for changing climate in this region are hotter summers and less snowpack. That means less white peaks. That means slightly less interesting photos. I don't want to trivialize what climate change can mean, but recognize the fact that we are all here in a beautiful setting. We all took photos of that incredible vista. It's preserving that vista not just for its beauty, but for a lot of other purposes, let's say tourism in this region. It's really important and critical. This is one of the reasons that we care. So, if we can go to my first slide, what I'd love to do is share some of my experience with working in the space of CO2 conversion and try to give you some suggestions about how we think about, how the marketplace is thinking about procurement. That means procurement of technologies that can transform post-combustion or any form of CO2 into useful products and materials, services, but also the technologies themselves. When you talk about productive use of CO2, an interesting thing happens. You break into the materials markets, which we haven't discussed much today, and the actual technology markets we've discussed a little bit. I'd like to give some perspective on both. I appreciate the introduction. I work on the Carbon XPRIZE, sponsored by NRG and COSIA, which means I support the individuals in this picture. I love this photo. This is a photo we took almost a year ago at the Future of Energy Summit put on by Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Thanks, Bloomberg. Thanks, Susan Kish, for helping us run a great panel. These are the leaders of the 10 finalists in the competition. Those are the people in the top left that are looking mildly interested and applauding, hopefully. You can see some of these people are holding their trophies. We said, congratulations, you've demonstrated you have a working piece of CO2 conversion technology. Here's $500,000 as part of a down payment toward a future prize purse. And we'd love to give you a bit of wind behind your sails as you proceed to compete in the competition. So just a quick background. The competition is a $20 million global incentive prize effort to try to stimulate breakthrough innovation in technologies that can convert CO2 emissions from an industrial point source, in this case, into any useful material or product. We don't care what material, and we don't care what process you use, but we've been running this competition for around 3.5 years. We anticipate closing it next year, which means one or two of these individuals and their teams will walk away with hopefully $7.5 million, which is 1/2 of the prize purse on the line. The incentive prize model is meant to draw out a lot of interesting ideas, but really it's meant to help kickstart and grow the ecosystem around not just the technology development, but also what it means to use these technologies, these materials, get them into real markets, get them actually productive, having them make a climate and hopefully economic impact. So it's with that context that I come at the topic of how do we think about procurement for CO2 technologies and the materials themselves. So let's go to the next slide. A quick background. What are we talking about when we talk about CO2-based materials? Start at the bottom, which are a set of recognizable, hopefully recognizable images. These are things you might recognize from your life, or you've probably seen them. Okay, just hold that thought, that you recognize these. From this is a list of sort of base materials that are often pursued in the CO2 conversion trajectory. We heard some examples of this. Elizabeth spoke really well from LanzaTech about what they're doing, and there are many other examples. On the right are maybe slightly more recognizable product or material names. There's no magic in between them. They're sort of just a base ingredient and maybe working up to a more refined product. But the point here is we're talking, again, about recycling of CO2 emissions into something useful or productive. I'm going to dwell on this side for a little bit to speak about what procurement could mean when we think about the materials side of the equation. So remember, there are technologies and technology developers behind this that look a little bit like what LanzaTech is doing. They might be huge, like the size of Petronova. Eventually, they might be much smaller and niche. Keep that in your mind, but let's focus just on materials now. I think it's important to recognize, before we get into the details of what procurement can mean, to point out that a CO2-based material, especially something that's recognizable, can be a really great entry point for a much broader community into this topic, whether you're talking about capture, direct air capture, or use. Someone asked earlier, should we be competing as an elite group against the political capital and power of a mass movement? Okay? My version of that is that I'm not saying that a CO2-based winter coat is going to create a mass social movement, but it's something that the public, that section of the public which is hungry to do something, can understand and can engage with. They could potentially inform a brand about what it would take for them to buy that coat. I'd be willing to pay 6% more, or 0. I'd like to pay less. But it's because we're talking about consumer goods eventually and manufactured goods, it's a little bit more participatory than a project finance project, even though the climate impact may be much less. I'm not saying no amount of winter coats is going to get us out of the climate problem, but it's a way to engage a much broader audience. So I encourage you to think about, when you think about procurement, first start with the notion that engaging with consumer products is a way to get a much greater section of the population thinking about the topic, thinking about what carbon capture even is, how you go about doing it. That's how we get to policy change. That's how we get to broader buy-in, and even manufacturers to support and create some technology and financing pull for this type of approach, and carbon capture, and even carbon removal. Now, of course, to make this real and relevant, there are many ways to make products out of CO2. Many of them just make more CO2. Okay? We actually want to reduce emissions, even by a small amount. So it's important to distinguish between things that are carbon negative, carbon neutral, and carbon positive, but avoiding emissions. There was an example earlier of jet fuel that might represent avoided emissions, or maybe even be carbon neutral. It's great. If an incumbent material can replace, or if a CO2 material can replace an incumbent material and be less carbon intensive, that's a win in terms of overall emissions. That is not carbon negative, that's a different thing, but it's still a win. So think about that. How do you know that it's a win or not, or whether it's carbon negative or positive? We need detailed life cycle analysis tools to figure out exactly what is what. I want to give a shout out to Global CO2 Initiative. Volker Sick is here. His group has led a fantastic development of some LCA guidelines and TEA guidelines that you're going to see rolled out and applied, hopefully, in this space to help all of us figure out what is an interesting project that is actually not going to reduce emissions, and what is a project that will. And we can focus on those in those contexts. Another important step is to get materials actually into the hands of manufacturers and supply chains. What does it take to actually get a stack of cinder blocks from an interesting demo into real construction? Well, you need to address codes and standards. We're talking about a new material or a replacement material that has a fundamentally different chemistry. It's important to recognize that codes and standards are going to be a major burden or barrier or an opportunity to get involved, do some education around what these materials are, do some extensive testing. This is the burden that's right now borne by the technology developers, and it's quite a huge burden. Something that we can do in the room is help to push that conversation among codes and standards developers, whether you're talking about a replacement like methanol or something that has structural properties like carbon fiber or concrete. The codes and standards communities are going to have to be brought in, whether it's through an existing ISO or an initial conversation about what that means. Again, how do we get these products, these materials into supply chains? Government procurement is another one. This is something that's often spoke about by the building materials folks, and I think maybe increasingly by fuels folks. To the extent that federal and state governments are massive purchasers, owners of projects, users of materials, it's not too difficult to see how procurement standards or regulations allowing these types of materials, once properly codified through LCA, once properly tested and verified through codes and standards, could be eligible for other procurement contracts. What would it mean for, this is not a MEDIC example, the state of California to allow a CO2-based concrete to bid on airport or rail construction? There are some companies bidding on that today. That's a major market pull and a major opportunity for developers to continue developing their technologies, bring down the cost, and actually bring materials to market, show which ones work, which ones don't, which ones have a lot of climate or CO2 uptake potential, and which ones don't. So let me leave materials there. There's a lot more to be said, but I want to move on to technologies. Next slide, please. Just back to the carbon XPRIZE, for example. The teams are testing at 2 industrial test sites. One of them is right here in Wyoming. It's in the other corner of the state. It's called the Wyoming Integrated Test Center. Thank you, Jason Beggar and the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority for making this possible. Here's a photo of some of the competitors lined up at the opening. This is a pretty user-friendly facility where technologies are going to be developed and tested under real operating conditions. They're going to use a tiny fraction of the real flue gas coming off of Dry Fork Station, most recent power station, I think, coal power station built in the nation, was mentioned earlier. These are test facilities that we get to use for our XPRIZE competition, but that future technology developers will get to use. We're talking about the hardware now. We're not talking about the materials markets. There's a similar facility. The top row of photos is its sister facility called Alberta Carbon Conversion Technology Center. It's in the province of Alberta in Calgary, also next to a power station. That's called the Shepherd Energy Center. It's about an 800 megawatt gas station. Same kind of setup, but just in Canada, using the emissions of gas. For reference, the CO2 concentration is about 5% on the top, far fewer impurities. On the bottom, much richer in CO2, about 13% is where they run. But you have to deal with things like some minor impurities, scrubbing some of the oxygen, et cetera. I bring up these facilities because they're examples of infrastructure. This is something we can do to generate accelerate the pace of development of these technologies, is put together infrastructure for testing of these innovative solutions. It's pretty hard to go from a tiny lab pilot to a $500 million deal that Oxy and Carbon Engineering told us about. Many of these developers are not 9 years into it, 10 years into it, the way Carbon Engineering is. To follow the path of Carbon Engineering, or maybe shave a few years off of that kind of trajectory, we think these facilities can be very helpful. So the point here is development of infrastructure we think can be a big win. But then, of course, I want to point out a few things that are endemic to the CO2 conversion space. Some of them have been addressed today, but they absolutely must be addressed by people like in this room if we're thinking about how to take these technologies from things the size of dishwashers up to things the size of approaching power stations, or maybe even a tenth of that, let's say getting into the kilotons or even megatons annually. We have to think about things like siting. This is where the materials markets and the sources of CO2 come together. Building next to a power station is great for your source of CO2, but what are you going to do with, let's say, the ready-mix concrete you produce at this site? Not much. Ready-mix is usually built within an hour or prepared within an hour of its use. Do you site your facility near the market? In which case you need a CO2 transport solution. You could truck it, you could tube trailer it, or CO2 pipelining. So I'm tying back into something that's been brought up earlier. The use of hydrogen. Fundamentally, using CO2 to make materials is competing with fossil hydrocarbons. You get the carbon from CO2, you don't get the hydrogen. Where are you going to get the hydrogen from? In very broad strokes, you need a low carbon source of hydrogen to make this work, to make these things carbon neutral, offsetting, or even carbon negative. So sources of green hydrogen are also going to be crucial, and something to think about as we think about how do these technologies scale and what does procurement mean. A couple of things I want to close with. The most important thing, I think, today in the state of CO2 conversion and generating technologies is access to capital. Back to the technology innovators, next slide please. How do they follow in the footsteps of a Carbon Engineering? How do we have more Carbon Engineering, Chevron, Oxy announcements of the type that we heard? It takes capital. It takes private capital. A lot of these technologies are capital intensive, they are new, they face technology risk, they're uncertain. There are even questions about are they real and do they even work, and are we actually doing anything relevant to climate? Legitimate questions that all need to be answered. These are the type of questions investors ask. They know these questions too. An initiative we've started, which is an invitation to this room, at XPRIZE is called the Circular Carbon Network. It runs independent of the prize competition. It has nothing to do with who wins, loses, and the judging and all that. But it's about actually trying to bring innovators and technology providers and investors together. In a couple of months, we're going to launch what we're calling a company index and deal list. It's a list of the several hundred carbon tech companies, groups we are aware of in the world. We've worked with a few of our partners, Carbon 180, Global CO2 Initiative, CO2 Value Europe, which is a trade association that started up there, to just make a list. We're going to make it publicly available. Visit our website in a couple, if you visit the website, it looks like this now. In a couple of months, it'll be refreshed with the new tool. It's meant for you to engage, use for your own purposes, scan the list. If you're an investor, it's a place to have a look at what is going on. But I bring it up in the procurement context because I think it's beyond just private capital. A lot of these startups and technology developers are looking for strategic partners. How do they find their Occidental Petroleum? How do they find their NRG to make the future Petronovas? They're looking for strategic partnerships that can help them scale their technology, but also access markets, material markets, or other types of markets. The last word I'd love to leave you with is something completely different. What happens after the Carbon XPRIZE is awarded? We'll have a big party, we'll celebrate, and we'll wake up the next day and get back to how do we actually get these materials and technologies into market. Today, we're also working on the design of a future prize. This is a work in progress. This is an invitation for your feedback. Completely separate project, but I bring it up here because the procurement issues will appear here. Technology, materials, and actually much more. We have in mind at XPRIZE that to push the space of carbon forward, we need radical technology development and solution making more broadly in carbon removal. This is active removal of existing CO2, mostly from the atmosphere, but some of it is dissolved in the ocean. If you have a great idea on how to dissolve CO2 from the ocean, we'd love to hear it. We've narrowed in, over the last few months of design, and many of you have been involved in this process, which we thank you for, on a few key parameters to focus on. One is the cost of removal. It's clear that reducing the cost of removal, Steve teased us with way, way, way less than 500 bucks a ton and said he hoped the first station would be 100 bucks a ton. I don't know if you're still in here, Steve, but we're all rooting that you get to 100 and be low. It's clear that the lower the better, but 100 or 50, depending on who you ask, is sort of a notional target that we think could unlock a lot of change. A second category of things is, here it's listed as sequestration time. Here I'm pointing out that there's a difference between converting CO2 into material that immediately will re-release the CO2 and something that will lock it away forever or long enough to be relevant in a climate context. This category could be recategorized as climate relevance. Sequestration time matters, whether it's carbon neutral, negative, or positive, but avoided emissions hopefully is relevant here. Of course, we need the LCA tools here again to distinguish. But clearly this matters. It's not just about the cost, it's about is it relevant to climate. And the third area we're thinking to focus on is value creation. There are many CO2 many CO2 removal solutions that generate direct value, let's say in the form of a material that could be sold, or indirect value in the form of, let's say, healthier soils. A couple panels ago, they talked a lot about the healthy soils are maybe a better way to get into a climate conversation because who's against healthy soils? Climate, mixed reviews, but it's clear that dragging carbon into the soils is a win. How do we do that? So we're thinking of focusing on metrics in these bins. There's a lot more thought that's gone into this, but I'm putting this out there to kind of challenge and hopefully provoke a little bit. My colleague from XPRIZE, Nikki Batchelor, is here, standing at the back of the room. If you think this is a terrible idea, please tell us. If you think it's a great idea, please tell us. We're hoping to design a prize and wrap up our initial design in the next few weeks, and then move ahead to eventually launching a program maybe next year, maybe the year after. The bottom row are some interesting images. Don't read too much into them, but they're just highlighting different types of carbon removal solutions out there. They are wildly different. Carbon engineering looks a little bit like that. We talked about healthy soils. Someone said the first consumer product, like a sneaker, that could be carbon removing. This is a hypothetical made-up picture. But again, back to tie it up to the beginning, I think there would be a lot of public interest in a consumer product that was actually removing. Is that a fiction or a fantasy? We're not sure. A prize with clear metrics and parameters to drive the space forward is a great way to incentivize innovation and hopefully draw a community together. Those are the end of my remarks. I'd love for you to ask a lot of questions or make any snide remarks, but I want to leave you with the fact that we're really focused on what it means to do procurement for the materials and for the technologies involved in CO2 conversion and eventually carbon removal. the fact that it takes a lot of public and private partnership. The state, federal, and state has a huge role to play, but so does potentially the interested public who is hungry for climate solutions to not just believe in, but participate in. CO2-based products or even carbon removal, depending on the endpoints, could be a bridge between the types of conversations we have in these rooms and the millions of other people who are interested to participate but maybe aren't exactly sure what this topic can mean to them. Let me leave it there. Look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. And now we're going to hear from Miranda Ballentine, who is the CEO of the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, who is an alliance of clean energy buyers, developers, service providers, and NGOs working on a lot of corporate renewable deals. She has great public and private sector experience, including a 3-year stint as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, where she was responsible for a $9 billion energy budget and launched the Resilient Energy Demonstration Initiative, developing clean, cyber-secure microgrids. And also in her private sector experience was Walmart's Director of Sustainability for Renewable Energy. So some tremendous experience on these particular issues. Miranda, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
So I feel a little bit like the black sheep in the room, and just to make sure that I feel that way correctly, can you raise your hand if you are here primarily as a large energy buyer? I recognize we all buy energy and all of our companies use energy, but your role here is to come and learn about energy projects off of which carbon is being sequestered or reutilized, but certainly captured, and you want to know where these projects are so that you can buy the electrons. Isn't Thomas still in the room? Okay, 1. So I am the black sheep in the room. So I've spent most of my career on the buy side of the clean energy equation, and I'll tell you, has anybody here worked for Walmart? Raise your hand. Okay, exactly 0. Has anybody here worked for the Air Force? Active duty or civilian? Exactly 0. Okay, I'm really the black sheep in the room, but I'll tell you, both Walmart and the Air Force, at this point in the day, with faces like this, we'd make you stand up and do a cheer or sing a song. So be glad that I'm not doing that. You can go to the next slide. What I'm really here to do is to start a conversation. So we have heard several times throughout the day, does the demand side of this equation matter? Some folks have said yes, some folks have said not really. If we get the policy and the technology and the price right, then the demand will show up. Others have said demand actually really does matter. And so I'm really here to start a conversation, and so I'm going to try to get through my slides actually super quickly so that we can have some snide remarks and hopefully interesting dialogue. But let me tell you a little bit about who REBA is, why we exist, and then I'm going to go a little bit into the state of the utility scale renewable energy market, not because I want to pit renewables against non-renewables with carbon capture, but because I want to show the power of the demand side of the market, and when the demand side of the market is mobilized, what it can do. And then I'll share a little bit about some key trends and key themes, which I think are relevant for this conversation that just came out of our member summit, which had about 400 people attending at Disney World a couple weeks ago. So our theory of change is that the demand side does matter, that large energy consumers, non-residential, non-utility energy buyers have a unique role to play in driving the zero carbon energy future that we are all trying to achieve. Our vision is a resilient zero carbon energy system. So that's the first part of it. The second part is where every organization has a viable, expedient path to procuring renewables or other types of clean energy, if that is their choice. So our community includes large energy buyers. There are about 200 large energy buyers in the community today. I'll show you just in a second who those folks are. But also large developers and service providers. So everybody in between a developer of a project and an off-taker of a project, the lawyers and the consultants and the brokers and the buyer's agents and everybody else that's in between. Financiers, really looking to unlock the marketplace. So you can go to the next slide. So who's part of the community? This is not a full list of all of our members. Our leadership circle members together are about $1 trillion a year in annual revenue, so it's pretty big companies. Probably mostly names that you recognize. And as I said, we have grown from about 13 companies in a room 5 years ago saying, hey, we need a place for large energy buyers to come together to tackle common barriers, to over 300 companies participating today, and about 200 of those are buyers. Next slide. Just a little bit about the power of this community when it's activated. This tracker shows utility scale corporate procurement over the course of roughly the last 5 years. Last year was obviously a banner year, and this year is starting out very strong as well. The overall goal of this community is to get to 60 gigawatts of new renewables by 2025. If every company that has a 100% renewable energy goal today, sorry, I'm trying to talk fast here, guys, because we got a fast timer. If everyone achieved their goals today, that would get us to 42 gigawatts. 60 gigawatts is the goal. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So who's doing these deals? We've had a dramatic increase in the number of companies doing deals. By the way, again, this is just utility scale deals. If you were to look at distributed generation solar, it's about another 6 gigawatts last year, and the number of companies goes up to the thousands. There are thousands of companies doing distributed scale renewables today. So you can see who the largest buyers were. Facebook by far trumped the community last year, but even without Facebook deals, last year was the biggest year to date. There are now about 75 large off-takers directly procuring renewable energy. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So this really shows the trajectory of number of new buyers in the market. We had 26 new buyers last year alone who had never transacted in the market. So it's a powerful community that when activated can really drive change. And that's something that I think we need to be thinking about as we're thinking about activating this community for carbon sequestration projects. Go to the next slide. I just think this sand chart's kind of interesting because it gives a sense of who's doing deals, what are the industries that are doing deals. At Walmart, we set, I think, the first 100% renewable energy goal back in 2005. But the IT sector, which is sort of this purple sector, really came out strong in the sort of 2008, 2009 time period and really dominated most of the procurement up until really the 2017 timeframe. So you're seeing a much wider array of buyers in the market today. Go ahead and go to the next slide. This is just tracking wind and solar. What's interesting is we are starting to see far more utility scale solar projects. Go to the next slide. All right, so this is really the next two slides are really the two slides I wanted to get to because I think it's most relevant for the conversation today. So I just gave you a bunch of data about utility scale renewables. All right, and some of you are probably thinking, yeah, but that's what's causing the problem for sequestration, or yeah, but that's what's causing the problem with intermittency in the system. So what is the role, what are large energy consumers thinking about next? And there's been a very significant transition, and very rapid, I would say, in the last couple of years, to start thinking beyond renewable energy as the end. Companies are now seeing renewable energy as a means to an end, but only one of several means. And so we just, like I said, we just had our member summit a couple of weeks ago, and we laid out from our previous research these 6 trends that we're seeing large energy buyers interested in playing a role in. And then we did a live poll in the room and asked them, of these 6 trends, what's the most important to you? Is it dealing with the intermittency of wind and solar? So storage deployment? Is it looking at offshore wind, which is a trend we're starting to see really come up? Is it dealing with transmission to get renewable sources from where they're abundant to where your load centers are? Is it resilience and the challenge of security challenges and vulnerabilities in our system? is it a transition from 100% renewable energy to 24/7 zero carbon? Or is it looking at other social and environmental impacts of your energy goals? Because most of these companies have a big suite of renewable energy plus other sustainability goals. You guys want to take a guess? What was the biggest of these 6 when we polled the audience? What was number 1? Who thinks it was storage deployment? All right, who thinks people thought they should be focused on offshore wind? Who thinks people thought they should be focused on transmission? Who thinks that this audience was focused on resilience? I wish that was the case. Spoiler alert. Who thinks the transition from 100% RE to 24/7 zero carbon? And who thinks incorporating other social and environmental impacts? All right, so sort of split. Let's roll the slide. Here's how it turned out. As somebody who spent 3 years studying the security and vulnerability of our system, that scares me. But those of you that raised your hand, and it was probably a quarter of the room, guessed this one. This is a major shift. We are starting to see companies, including Walmart, who set the first 100% renewable energy goal in 2005, now setting science-based target goals. We're seeing companies like Google raise your hand if you have read the Google white paper. Put your hand down, raise your hand if you have no idea what I'm talking about when I say Google white paper. Okay, so go Google white paper. Google has largely achieved their goal to procure 100% renewable electricity, enough to meet their overall usage. But they know that they're not using 24/7 zero carbon power because they can't always buy renewables close to where their load center is. So they wrote a fantastic white paper. I think you should all read it. And it's really driving a lot of conversation in the large energy user community to shift the conversation away from renewable energy as the end to as one of the means to the end, to a 24/7 zero carbon power system. 51 seconds left. So that's it. That's all I got for you, and we'll take your questions and snide comments, and away we go.